minds, brains, souls, and the Mass in B minor, essentially Appendix B. Questions of Truth, Part 2.
Well, there it is, the Mass in B minor. And what I hope to convince you of today is at least the reasonableness of two ideas. First of all, that the existence of the Mass in B minor and things like it are a problem for materialism, even if we define materialism rather generously, saying that the only things that exist are either material objects or sets of material objects or mathematical objects. Some materialists wouldn't even accept that there are mathematical objects. Some people call themselves physicalists rather than materialists, which I think that view has the same problems. The second thing I hope to convince you of is that there is this very misleading metaphor that goes around about the brain being some kind of machine. People say things like, advances in neuroscience have shown that we have no free will and no freedom. And I think we can demonstrate that that just cannot be true. So, let's see how far we get. This is a generous definition of materialism. What is it about a musical work that I think may be interesting for this purpose? If you've got a musical work, then I'm going to define a score of a musical work as any material object or set from which a competent set of performers could perform the work. And we'll designate the set of all the scores of this work by scores of W. That would include, the neural traces in people's heads if the performers could perform it from memory. So here, in principle, is a score of the Mass in B minor. Now, I have a problem with materialism. I'm never quite sure what materialism is meant to mean, because I'm not sure there's a very good definition of a material object. But I only really need a couple of properties. First of all, I think that if you've got two distinct material objects, or sets of material objects, then it must be logically possible either for X to exist without Y existing, or vice versa. Because material objects are supposed to occupy definite positions in space and time. And if it were necessarily true that two material objects always occupied the same definite positions in space and time and had the same properties in every respect, so you could never have one without the other or the other without the one, I don't think they would be distinct material objects. The second materialist view that I think is problematic, but I think you're committed to if you're a materialist, is that a musical work exists if and only if a competent set of performers could in principle perform it. The idea, for example, of a musical work existing in the mind of God seems to me to be ruled out if you're a materialist. So far, so good. Now, whether or not you're a materialist, it's pretty obvious that if it's possible to change A without changing B, then A and B are not the same. And the other thing I think is pretty obvious is that the Mass in B minor exists, but there was a time when it didn't exist, before Bach was born, for example. Now, I just need two more things. First of all, if there's a score of a musical work, then it's possible to create another score without changing the musical work or changing the original score. So here we have two scores. And the other thing, which I don't strictly need, but I kind of want, is that if we have got two scores of a musical work, it's possible to destroy one of the scores without changing the other or the musical work. Now, there are various ways of destroying a score, but this is the Royal Institution. And liquid oxygen was first identified and isolated at the Royal Institution by Dewar, with the Dewar flask. So, we take some liquid oxygen that was made earlier. remove the water glasses, which may not be improved by this experiment. So, I am, in principle, destroying a score of the musical work. The other score, if I keep it far enough away, will be unchanged, and probably all the other scores in existence of this musical work will be unchanged by this activity. And as far as I can tell, the musical work is still the same. Sounds rather similar to me. Now, the reason I think this is a problem for materialism is because of 4, we know that the Mass in B minor is not a mathematical object or set. Because of this idea 2, that essentially boils down to the fact that the musical work will exist if and only if there exists some kind of score, some kind of possibility, in other words, of performers being able to perform this musical work, if materialism is true, which, taking from proposition 1, implies that for a materialist, the Mass in B minor must be the set of all the scores of the Mass in B minor. On the other hand, we've just demonstrated that it's possible to change the set of scores of the Mass in B minor without changing the Mass in B minor. And consequently, we seem to have some kind of contradiction in materialism. Now, of course, materialists can go back and say, well, we don't believe that the Mass in B minor really exists, or you can dispute one of these premises. There are no knockdown arguments in this. But what this at least very strongly suggests is that in addition to material objects and mathematical objects, there's a class of objects which we might call informational objects. Because obviously what's important, the Mass in B minor isn't just the scores, but in some sense it's to do with the information that the scores contain, the information that a CD contains, even the information that you get when you hear it. These are all, if you like, aspects of the Mass in B minor. And once you expand your ontology, or set of things that you believe to exist, to include informational objects, you have a good place to park things like web browsers, software, but also a place to park minds and even souls, as well as music. Now, this would all be interesting, but perhaps not very helpful, if it were true that your brain was some kind of machine. If we were all automata, you might say, rather as the CD player is an automaton, yes, it's representing some kind of information, but in a sense the information isn't doing anything that other than something that's totally predictable from the material object.